The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over. It's my solemn promise that when President Trump threatens us again, we will fight back. We will fight back with everything we have to get the best deal for Canada. We will build an independent future for our country, stronger than ever.
No. You are not going to change your mind?
No, I'm not. Look, we've been ripped off for years, and we're not going to be ripped off anymore. No, I'm not going to bend at all. Aluminum or steel or cars, we're not going to bend. We've been ripped off as a country for many, many years. We've been subjected to costs that we shouldn't be subjected to. In the case of Canada, we're spending $200 billion a year to subsidize Canada. I love Canada. I love the people of Canada.
America never thought it could be locked out of its own future, but overnight, that's exactly what happened. While U.S. leaders were busy arguing over politics, Africa and Canada executed a move so precise, so coordinated, and so massively disruptive that it sent shockwaves through every major American industry. In a single announcement, the two countries froze the U.S. out of the very minerals needed to power electric cars, military tech, smart devices, and everything the American economy depends on.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is laying out his plan for Canada to be its own best customer. Today, the Prime Minister revealed more details on the Liberals' Buy Canadian policy as they try to use federal dollars to boost demand for tariff-strapped Canadian industry.
The world has become more dangerous and divided, and that decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States is over.
Something seismic unfolded tonight in Ottawa.
Factories across the U.S. went silent, automakers panicked, tech giants issued emergency memos. And Wall Street watched in disbelief as billions evaporated in hours. For the first time, and America was not leading the future, it was locked outside of it. Across Africa, excitement exploded as massive new projects, refineries and mineral routes were launched with Canadian technology and African ambition. The continent that the world once overlooked was now at the center of the global EV race.
The 2025 nickel tariff war has ignited one of the fiercest clashes between Washington and Ottawa in decades. A 20 to 30% duty on EV metals, especially nickel, sent shockwaves through Detroit's battery belt, inflating costs and pushing EV prices beyond reach. Canada, once America's steady supplier, retaliated, redirecting exports to Europe and Asia while fueling its own industries. Now, with whispers of tariff exemptions surfacing, the battlefield shifts again.
Rewriting the rules and forcing superpowers to fall in line. Canada, once America's closest ally, had crossed the line no one thought possible, joining Africa to create the largest, cleanest, and most powerful battery supply network ever seen. The U.S. wasn't just surprised, it was stunned, because Africa and Canada didn't just build an alliance. They pulled the plug on America's entire EV future. And now the world is watching the collapse unfold in real time.
First. For Canada, we're only going to accept the best deal for Canada that is very much informed.
The news broke like a thunderclap across global markets. Africa and Canada had signed a sweeping minerals cooperation pact, one that quietly, almost coldly, excluded the United States from every tier of its supply chain strategy. For decades, the U.S. assumed its dominance in mining technology, battery design, and automotive leadership, would guarantee its role in the emerging electric vehicle race. But the world had changed, and the U.S. found itself watching from outside a locked gate it once controlled. The agreement between Africa and Canada wasn't just another political gesture. It was a direct reordering of the global EV ecosystem. Africa held nearly half of the world's cobalt, a significant share of its graphite growing, reserves of lithium, and vast deposits of nickel and copper. Canada possessed its own treasure trove of critical minerals, high-purity nickel, rare earth elements, and one of the cleanest, most efficient mining sectors anywhere on Earth. By merging their capabilities, they created a minerals bloc so powerful that analysts quickly dubbed it the new battery kingdom the United States had expected. The agreement to include them, or at least leave room for negotiation, But neither continent offered a seat. Africa had grown weary of being treated as a raw material supplier rather than an equal partner. Canada had grown frustrated with the U.S. making promises on climate, manufacturing incentives, and mineral agreements that never fully materialized, and together they saw an opportunity to shape the future not as junior partners, but as architects. The U.S. response was immediate panic. Automakers across states like Michigan, Ohio, and Texas scrambled for clarity. Battery manufacturers called emergency summits. Politicians issued statements that sounded confident but felt hollow underneath. The U.S. had spent years trying to pivot away from Asia, especially China, for battery materials. But in that pivot, it underestimated just how strategically Africa and Canada had been aligning with each other behind the scenes. Africa's ministers described the move as overdue sovereignty. For years, African governments had quietly worked to build processing plants instead of exporting raw ore. New facilities in countries like Zambia and Tanzania were turning copper and nickel into battery-grade materials. Lithium fields in Zimbabwe were being transformed with new investments from across the continent, while Namibia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo were coordinating regional policies to halt unrefined exportation altogether. Canada applauded every step of Africa's industrial rise. It respected Africa's push for value addition and saw a partnership where each side benefited equally. When they announced their alliance, Canada emphasized transparency, sustainability, and fair pricing, three things that resonated strongly with African nations tired of being told to accept what global powers dictated. The U.S. saw the implications immediately. Without access to Africa's cobalt and lithium, and without Canada's nickel and rare earths feeding into American factories, the entire U.S. EV transition slowed to a crawl. Factories that once bragged about becoming fully electric by 2030 quietly revised their expectations. Some paused hiring, some paused production, some began warning shareholders of material shortages. Meanwhile, Africa and Canada moved quickly. They signed logistics agreements connecting African ports directly to Canadian refineries and processing centers, bypassing traditional routes. They launched joint research programs to develop next-generation solid-state batteries. They announced the creation of a new minerals trading platform designed to set global prices rather than simply accept them. This wasn't just an economic arrangement, it was a statement of independence. Africa had spent decades building leverage, with population growth, rapidly industrializing cities, and technological adoption soaring. The continent understood its minerals were not a burden, they were a global key, and this time Africa refused to let other nations hold that key on its behalf. In Toronto, the announcement was met with applause. In Lagos, it was met with celebration, but in Washington, the atmosphere was somber. Reports circulated that the U.S. had attempted last-minute diplomacy to be included in the deal, but Africa insisted that after decades of underinvestment and extractive policies, the partnership was designed to support those who supported Africa's growth, not those who only acknowledged Africa when critical materials ran short. News outlets began replaying a moment from the announcement ceremony, the African delegation declaring that industrial respect must replace industrial dependency. It became a symbolic line that echoed across social media platforms. Many Americans were shocked to realize that Africa now had the leverage to freeze out one of the world's wealthiest nations. But the truth was simple: Africa had always possessed the resources, but now it had the unity, policy alignment, and economic strategy to wield them. Canada amplified the message. It insisted that its cooperation with Africa was about building a long-term supply chain that guaranteed both stability and fairness. The U.S., it claimed, had relied too long on short-term agreements and unpredictable trade stances. Battery developers in Canada celebrated the decision, saying it would unlock unprecedented opportunities for innovation. The U.S. corporate sector reacted with disbelief. Many believed Africa would never take such a bold step. Others assumed Canada would never jeopardize its trade relationship with the U.S., but both assumptions were wrong. A new world was rising, one in which supply chains were not dictated by historical alliances, but by strategic alignment. Factories across the U.S. began cutting production forecasts. The semiconductor crisis of previous years had taught Americans how fragile global supply chains were, but this new mineral exclusion was far worse. Without cobalt, lithium, nickel, or rare earth elements, even the most technologically advanced factories were useless. Some U.S. automakers attempted to form emergency partnerships in South America, but most of those countries had already signed pre-agreements with Africa's trading bloc. In Africa's capitals, leaders spoke confidently. They described this moment as a turning point where Africa shaped global policy instead of reacting to it. Young Africans celebrated online, calling it the minerals revolution. Canada saw itself as a stabilizer nation supporting Africa's rise while securing its own influence in the global battery chain. The two partners moved quickly to announce a joint industrial fund, with billions dedicated to mining technology, clean energy projects, and the construction of new manufacturing plants within Africa. The U.S. watched as the world adjusted, recalibrated, and shifted around it. And for the first time in generations, America realized it was no longer the center of the global industrial universe. Canada and Africa wasted no time turning their alliance into action. Within weeks of the agreement, survey teams were dispatched across multiple African countries, mapping mineral belts with precision satellites and advanced Canadian geological drones. For decades, foreign corporations had used outdated or intentionally vague data to undervalue African deposits. Now, with full transparency and shared technology, Africa was seeing the true scale of its mineral wealth, and it was far greater than most previous estimates. In countries like Namibia, Zambia, and Ghana, new processing zones were being laid out with meticulous planning. Canada brought modern engineering, zero-waste mineral refining, techniques, and environmental safeguards that could compete with the standards of Europe. Africa brought the land, the minerals, the labor force, and the political momentum. The synergy was undeniable, and the world felt the tremors. China, long the dominant player in battery minerals, reacted cautiously at first. But analysts quickly noticed that China understood the depth of the shift. China had heavily invested in African mining for years, but Africa's new stance on refining and domestic value retention meant Beijing would need to renegotiate its strategies, perhaps even cooperate with the new bloc. The mineral era was becoming multipolar, and Africa held the center seat. Europe reacted with mixed emotions. Some nations supported the rise of the new alliance, hoping for alternative supply sources that weren't controlled by any single superpower. Others feared losing influence in regions they had dominated for generations. Yet even the most skeptical European countries privately acknowledged one irreducible fact: Africa and Canada were now writing rules for a new industrial era, and the rest of the world could either adapt or be left behind. Inside the United States, urgency grew into desperation. EV demand was surging domestically, driven by climate goals and consumer shifts. Dealerships across the country had begun advertising electric trucks, electric SUVs, electric delivery vans, mobility built on a future that now looked increasingly uncertain. Without mineral inputs, all of that ambition slowed into paralysis. American automakers publicly reassured customers and investors that they were seeking alternatives. But internally, their executives knew the truth. Reserves in the U.S. were too limited, too expensive to extract, too environmentally complicated to scale quickly. The country had once expected Canada to be its reliable partner for minerals, and Africa to remain a fragmented market, but both assumptions had collapsed in a single historic announcement as Africa and Canada rolled out their mineral blueprint. They also launched a global initiative called the Continental Battery Vision. It would train 50,000 African engineers and technicians within 5 years, blending Canadian expertise with African innovation. The program captured global attention. Youth across the continent saw a pathway into a high-value industry that had always been controlled elsewhere, with training centers opening in Kenya, South Africa, Morocco, and Senegal. The energy sector was becoming a magnet for African talent. Canada committed billions in long-term financing. In return, Africa offered stable contracts for decades into the future. The agreement, unlike those signed in past decades, did not favor one side over the other. The revenue split was balanced, governance was shared, and the decision-making process required joint councils made up of African and Canadian energy economists, engineers, and policy experts. The world wasn't used to seeing Africa sit at the head table with this level of authority, but that was the point. Africa was no longer asking. Africa was deciding. In Washington, the federal government began scrambling together incentives for domestic mining companies. They accelerated permits, offered tax relief, and attempted to streamline regulations. But the U.S. faced a problem far larger than bureaucracy. Even if new mines opened, the refining facilities were outdated. or too few. For years, America had allowed other nations to handle midstream processing. Now, trying to rebuild that infrastructure from scratch was like attempting to catch a train already at full speed. The U.S. also attempted to open talks with African leaders, but the responses came back cool and distant. Africa had not forgotten decades of one-sided agreements that left local communities devastated while foreign corporations took profits abroad. The new alliance with Canada allowed Africa to move without pressure, without compromise, without the shadow of a superpower forcing its will. The backlash from the U.S. lobby groups grew intense. Influential figures in the energy and automotive sector warned of a manufacturing crisis that could affect millions of workers. Some demanded tariffs, others demanded aggressive diplomacy, but neither would solve the core issue. Africa held the minerals, and now Africa controlled the terms. Meanwhile, African cities were transforming. Ports were being upgraded with advanced automation systems. High-speed rail links were being designed to move minerals from inland regions to coastal industrial hubs. Solar and wind megaplants, built in partnership with Canadian clean tech firms, powered new processing complexes. African economies were diversifying at a speed that shocked analysts who once predicted decades of slow, unstable growth. Africa was rewriting the narrative. The partnership allowed African countries to export high-value finished goods instead of cheap raw resources. Battery precursors, cathode materials, and even full battery systems were beginning to emerge from African factories. Countries that had been boxed into single-industry economies were suddenly participating in global high-tech manufacturing. Canada benefited tremendously as well. With Africa's resources, Canada's factories were running at unprecedented capacity. Canadian EV technology firms became world leaders. Their batteries lasted longer, charged faster, and were produced under the cleanest supply chain on the planet. Investors poured billions into Canadian innovation hubs, seeing them as the new center of global electrification. Back in the U.S., a quiet panic grew as automakers started floating rumors of relocation. Some considered moving to Canada, some evaluated partnerships in African regions that weren't yet fully integrated into the bloc, but Africa's new continental mineral strategy made it clear that every deal would have to align with Africa's industrial principles and none would permit backdoor access for America to bypass the alliance. Decisions, the U.S. retail market began feeling the consequences. EV prices rose, delivery times extended, startups that had boasted about launching new electric models halted operations. Wall Street analysts issued grim forecasts. The U.S., for the first time in a century, faced the prospect of being technologically outpaced in a field it had once pioneered. Africa and Canada, meanwhile, marched forward with certainty. Their leaders, standing side by side before international audiences, declared that their alliance was not formed to undermine any nation, it was formed to secure the future of their own people. But the world knew the truth behind the polite phrasing. By signing the agreement, Africa and Canada had frozen America out, and the global energy transition would now move on their terms.